The wind that scoured the plains of Redemption, Nebraska, was a merciless thing. It carried the grit of 1,000 barren miles and the scent of dust and despair. It whipped Alara's thin shawl against her face and tugged at the hem of her worn travel dress, a garment the color of faded hope. She clutched the sleeping bundle of her youngest, Rose, tighter against her chest, the rhythmic weight of the infant a fragile anchor in a world that had tilted off its axis. Beside her, 8-year-old Martha shivered, her small hand a permanent fixture in the folds of Alara's skirt. 10-year-old Caleb stood ramrod straight, his young face set in a grim imitation of a man's resolve, while 5-year-old Samuel stared with wide, uncomprehending eyes at the raw, splintered buildings that constituted the town. They were a desolate constellation of 4 children and 1 woman, deposited by the groaning stagecoach into a silence thick with judgment. The townspeople, emerging from the general store and the saloon, watched them. Their gazes were hard and sharp, dissecting her threadbare respectability, counting the heads of her children, calculating the weight of her burden. Alara felt their stares like physical blows, each one a confirmation of her folly, her utter, terrifying desperation. Her late husband, a man of gentle words and poor health, had left her with nothing but 4 beautiful, hungry mouths and a heart hollowed out by grief. The advertisement in the Eastern paper had seemed a sign from God, a lifeline thrown into the churning waters of her ruin. Homesteader seeks a wife, honest and hardy, must be of good character. The correspondence had been brief, factual. His name was Silas Kane. He owned 300 acres of land. He required a partner to build a life. She, in her replies, had been shamefully vague, a sin of omission that now felt like a stone in her gut. She had mentioned her son, Caleb, to prove her maternal nature, but had carefully avoided the plural. To confess the existence of 3 more would have been to guarantee his rejection. No man, especially not a stranger building a life from scratch, would willingly take on such a ready-made hardship. But the money for passage had been her last, and turning back was not an option. There was nothing to turn back to. Now, standing under the vast, indifferent sky, she scanned the handful of men on the boardwalk, searching for the one who would decide their fate. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. He wasn't among them. Her hope, already a meager flicker, threatened to extinguish entirely. Perhaps he had seen the 4 of them descend and simply walked away. Perhaps he was inside the saloon, drinking away his regret. Then she saw him. He was not on the boardwalk but standing apart, near the water trough, his shadow stretching long and dark in the afternoon sun. The word large from his letter was a profound understatement. Silas Kane was a giant, a man built of timber and rock, with shoulders that seemed to block out the sun and hands at the ends of his arms that looked capable of splitting logs with a single contemptuous squeeze. His hair was a dark, unruly thatch, his face shadowed by the brim of a stained hat, but she could see a thick beard and a jaw that looked as unforgiving as the landscape. The townsfolk gave him a wide berth, their earlier, intrusive stares now replaced by a wary, almost fearful respect. He was an island in the dusty sea of the main street, a man clearly and completely alone. He did not move towards her. He simply watched, his gaze as steady and assessing as a hawk's. The air grew thin in Alara's lungs. This was it, the moment of reckoning. Taking a deep, shuddering breath that did little to calm her, she gathered her children closer. "Stay here," she whispered to Caleb, her voice a dry rasp. She adjusted Rose in her arms and began the long walk across the street. Each step was a prayer and a penance. The dust puffed up around her ankles. The silence was absolute, broken only by the creak of a sign swinging in the relentless wind. She stopped a few feet before him, forced to crane her neck to look up at his face. His eyes, now that she was closer, were the color of a winter storm, gray and deep and unreadable. They weren't cruel, but they held no welcome either. They simply were. They took in her exhausted face, the dark circles under her eyes, the tremor in her hands, and then moved deliberately to the small, huddled group she had left by the stagecoach. He counted them. 1, 2, 3. His gaze lingered on them for a long moment before returning to her. The lie she had constructed, the carefully worded letters, all of it dissolved into dust. There was no hiding the truth that stood plain as day for the entire town to see. Her throat closed, and for a terrifying second, she thought she would be unable to speak. She swallowed, the sound loud in the oppressive quiet. "Mr. Kane," she began, her voice small, fragile. "I am Alara Vance." He gave a slow, deliberate nod. His expression did not change. The words tumbled out of her then, a torrent of shame and fear. "The letters, I was not entirely truthful. I wrote of my son. I have 4 children. I have 4". She repeated the number as if it were a confession of some mortal sin. She watched his face for any flicker of anger, of disgust, of the immediate and final rejection she expected. Nothing. He remained as still and silent as a mountain. "I understand if you wish to send us back," she stammered, the humiliation a hot flush on her cheeks. "I have no funds for the return passage, but I will work to repay you. I will scrub floors in the hotel, take in laundry, whatever is required. I only ask that you—" Her voice broke. She could not finish. She could not beg. All she could do was stand before him, stripped of all pride, her entire world hanging on the judgment in those stormy eyes. She lifted her chin, a final, desperate act of dignity. "I had to ask. Will you still marry me?" The silence that followed stretched into an eternity. The wind died down, and the world seemed to hold its breath. She could feel the weight of every stare from the boardwalk, every silent, smug prediction of her doom. Silas Kane's gaze did not leave her face. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and in that long, silent appraisal, she felt he saw everything. The gnawing fear, the fierce, protective love for her children, the sliver of steel that had carried her this far. His lips, barely visible in the thicket of his beard, parted. His voice, when it came, was not a shout, but a low rumble that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath his feet. It was deeper than any voice she had ever heard, a sound of gravel and thunder. He said only 3 words. "You're mine now." It was not a question. It was not a proposal. It was a declaration, as solid and immovable as the man who spoke it. It was a vow. He turned without another word and strode towards a large buckboard wagon hitched near the livery. He moved with a heavy, unhurried grace that seemed impossible for a man of his size. Alara stood frozen for a moment, the words echoing in her mind. "You're mine now." They were words of possession, yet in her desperate state, they sounded like sanctuary. She watched him lift a heavy crate from the wagon bed as if it were a child's toy and place it on the ground. A nudge at her elbow broke her trance. It was Caleb. "Mama?" he asked, his voice a worried whisper. "What did he say?" Alara looked from her son's anxious face to the broad, formidable back of Silas Kane. She took a breath, the first one that seemed to reach the bottom of her lungs since she'd stepped off the stagecoach. "He said we are to go with him," she answered, her own voice betraying her astonishment. She led her small flock to the wagon, a slow, uncertain procession. Silas hoisted their single, battered trunk into the back of the buckboard with one hand. He then turned to the children. Martha shrank behind Alara's skirts, and Samuel hid his face. Silas simply knelt, a creaking of leather and straining of canvas. He was still immense, a crouched bear of a man, but the action softened his terrifying scale. He did not speak to them. He merely looked at Caleb. He held out a large, calloused hand. After a moment of hesitation, Caleb, ever the brave one, placed his small hand in the giant's palm. Silas enveloped it gently and helped him up onto the wagon seat. He did the same for Samuel, lifting him as if he weighed no more than a sack of flour. He looked at Martha, who was now weeping silently into her mother's dress. He did not press her. He simply rose and turned to Alara. "The girl can sit with you," he rumbled, gesturing to the back. Alara climbed onto the rough planking of the wagon bed, her back against their trunk, arranging her skirts and settling Martha beside her, with Rose still cradled in her arms. She drew her children close, a hen gathering her chicks. Silas untied the horses and climbed onto the driver's seat. The bench creaked in protest. With a quiet click of his tongue and a flick of the reins, the wagon lurched forward, rolling out of redemption. Alara did not look back at the staring faces. She kept her eyes fixed forward, on the vast, empty prairie that stretched before them, a canvas of pale grass and endless sky. The journey was made in silence, a silence that was not empty but filled with the rhythmic clopping of the horses' hooves, the groaning of the wagon wheels, and the ceaseless sigh of the wind. Silas did not speak, his attention fixed on the barely visible track they followed. Alara watched the back of his head, the sheer breadth of his shoulders. He was a stranger, a man of intimidating size and few words, and she had just bound her life, and the lives of her children, to his. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. The landscape grew starker, lonelier. There were no trees, save for the occasional gnarled cottonwood clinging to life near a dry creek bed. There were no other homesteads, no signs of human life at all. The immensity of the land was overwhelming, a physical pressure that made her feel small and insignificant. This was his world. This was to be her home. As the miles fell away behind them, the initial wave of relief that had washed over her in town began to recede, replaced by a cold tide of uncertainty. He had accepted her, yes, but acceptance was not kindness. A vow of possession was not a promise of partnership. She had traded one form of desperation for another, and as the homestead finally came into view, a small, dark shape against the bruised twilight, she hugged her children tighter, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. The giant had claimed them, but the wilderness of his heart remained an uncharted and terrifying territory. The cabin was much like the man who built it. Solid, unadorned, and starkly functional. Hewn from thick, dark logs, it stood defiant against the vast emptiness of the prairie, a solitary testament to brute strength and endurance. A stone chimney rose from one end, and a small, covered porch sagged slightly at the front. Beside it stood a half-finished barn, its skeletal frame reaching like desperate fingers toward the darkening sky. A well, a corral with 2 horses, and a small, fenced-off garden plot completed the homestead. It was a place of survival, not comfort. Silas brought the wagon to a halt and was on the ground before the wheels had fully stopped turning. He moved with that same economy of motion she'd noted before, lifting the children down one by one. When he reached for Alara, she hesitated, but his large hands were already at her waist, swinging her to the ground with an ease that left her breathless. For a fleeting instant, she was aware of his strength in a way that was both frightening and strangely reassuring. He released her immediately and turned to unload their trunk. "The loft is for the boys," he said, gesturing with his head toward the cabin. It was the first full sentence he had spoken to her since they'd left town. "You and the girls can take the bed." He carried their trunk inside as if it were a satchel. Alara gathered her children and followed him into the deepening gloom. The interior was a single, large room, dominated by a massive stone fireplace that took up most of one wall. The air smelled of wood smoke, pine, and something else. The faint, clean scent of lye soap. A rough-hewn table and 2 benches stood in the center. In one corner was a bed, its frame built directly into the wall, covered with a thick pile of furs and a simple quilt. A ladder led to a sleeping loft above. The floor was packed earth, swept clean. It was Spartan, but it was not squalid. There was a deliberate order to the place, a sense of purpose. Silas set the trunk down and moved to the fireplace. He struck a match, and the kindling caught, casting flickering, monstrous shadows that danced on the log walls. The children huddled behind Alara, their small forms silhouetted by the nascent flames. "There's water in the bucket. Stew in the pot," he rumbled, his back to them as he coaxed the fire to life. "I'll be in the barn." And with that, he was gone, disappearing into the night, the heavy wooden door closing behind him with a solid thud. Alara stood in the sudden, ringing silence, listening to the crackle of the fire and the sound of her own unsteady breathing. He was giving them space. He was giving them the house. It was an act of consideration she hadn't expected, a small, unspoken kindness that felt monumental. She found the stew, thick with venison and root vegetables, hanging on a hook over the fire. She located bowls and spoons in a small cupboard and ladled out portions for the children, who ate in a weary, bewildered silence. Caleb, ever observant, climbed the ladder to inspect the loft. He returned with a report whispered to his mother. "There are 2 straw mattresses up there, and a blanket. It's clean, Mama." After they had eaten, Elara set about creating a semblance of a home. She found a length of rope in their trunk and, using 2 nails already in the wall, strung it up to create a curtain around the bed, a flimsy but necessary wall of privacy. She tucked Martha and a sleeping Rose into the bed, the furs surprisingly soft and warm. She watched Caleb and Samuel ascend to the loft, 2 small, brave pioneers in a new and frightening land. Only when the cabin was quiet, filled with the soft sounds of her children's breathing, did she allow herself to sit on the edge of the bed, the firelight playing on her clasped hands. The days that followed fell into a quiet, monotonous rhythm. Elara rose before the sun, rekindling the fire Silas had started before he left for his work. She cooked, she cleaned, she mended their worn clothes, she tended to the children. She imposed her own quiet order on the cabin's masculine austerity, her presence softening its hard edges. She found a patch of hardy wildflowers and placed a small bouquet in a tin cup on the table, a splash of color in a world of brown and gray. Silas remained a distant, silent presence. He would leave a dressed rabbit or a brace of quail on the porch in the mornings. He expanded the vegetable garden, his powerful form moving methodically as he turned the soil. He worked on the barn from sunup to sundown, the rhythmic thud of his hammer a constant, percussive backdrop to their days. He ate his meals on the porch steps, never joining them at the table, though Elara always left a plate for him by the door. He rarely spoke, communicating instead through action. When he noticed Samuel struggling to haul a bucket of water from the well, a smaller bucket appeared by the wellhead the next morning. When he saw Martha staring longingly at a bird's nest, a small, exquisitely carved wooden bird was left on the porch rail for her to find. She clutched it like a holy relic, the first gift she had ever received that wasn't a hand-me-down. He seemed most at ease with Caleb. He didn't try to talk to the boy, but would simply gesture for him to come near. He showed him how to read the tracks of animals in the dust, how to fletch an arrow with a hawk's feather, how to tell by the feel of the air if a storm was coming. It was a silent tutelage, a passing of knowledge from man to boy, and Elara watched from the cabin window as her son's wary respect for the giant slowly blossomed into a quiet, hero-worshipping admiration. Trust was not a decision, she learned, but a slow accretion, like a pearl forming around a piece of grit. It was built in the silent offering of a plate of food, in the provision of firewood stacked neatly by the door, in the steadfast, protective orbit he maintained around them. He was a wall between her family and the harshness of this land. Yet he remained a stranger. She knew nothing of his past, of his thoughts, of the reasons for his profound isolation. After 2 weeks, their supply of flour and salt was running low. The trip to redemption was a necessity she had been dreading. When she mentioned it, Silas simply nodded. Tomorrow, at dawn. The ride back to town was as silent as the first journey away from it, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer fraught with the terror of the unknown, but filled with a shared, unspoken understanding of the ordeal to come. As they rolled down the main street, the town's reaction was immediate and venomous. Windows were parted. People stopped on the boardwalks to stare. The whispers followed them like a swarm of angry bees. There's the brute with his ready-made brood. Shameless, that one, bringing all the mouths to feed. Wonder how long before he tires of her and casts her out. Elara kept her eyes forward, her spine rigid, her face a pale mask. She could feel Caleb bristling with indignation beside her in the wagon bed. Silas, on the driver's seat, seemed not to hear them. His face was granite, his gaze fixed straight ahead. He pulled the wagon up in front of the general store and disembarked. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice low and flat. But Mr. Henderson, the store owner, a portly man with a sour disposition, came out onto the porch, wiping his hands on a greasy apron. "I ain't extending no more credit to you, Kane," he called out, his voice loud enough for the entire street to hear. "Not with that," he gestured dismissively at Alara and the children. "You can pay cash, or you can starve." Alara's face burned with humiliation. She saw the smirks on the faces of the onlookers. This was their punishment for daring to build a life on the fringes, for being different. Silas did not rise to the bait. He turned slowly, his immense frame blocking Henderson from her view. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He simply stood there, a silent mountain of a man, and looked at the shopkeeper. The sheer, intimidating force of his presence was more potent than any shouted threat. Henderson's smug expression faltered. He blustered for a moment, then his gaze dropped. From a leather pouch at his belt, Silas produced a small, heavy stack of coins and placed them on the counter. The sound of the metal hitting the wood was sharp and final. "Flour, salt, coffee, lamp oil," he stated, his voice a low growl that carried an unmistakable note of menace. Henderson scurried to fill the order without another word. As they loaded their supplies, Alara saw it clearly. The town's scorn wasn't just for her. It was for him. He had been living with this isolation, this judgment, long before she had arrived. He was an outsider, a man they feared and resented. And by joining him, she and her children had stepped into that circle of exile with him. As they rode out of town, leaving the whispers and the hateful stares behind, she looked at his broad, unyielding back. For the first time, she felt not fear or uncertainty, but a fragile, unexpected kinship. They were two outcasts, bound together against a world that did not want them. And in that shared desolation, a tiny, resilient seed of loyalty began to take root. The fragile piece of their existence was shattered by the arrival of a man on a fine, bay mare. He rode with an air of unearned authority, his suit coat too clean for the prairie, his smile thin and predatory. Alara was hanging laundry on a line strung between the cabin and a cottonwood when he reined in his horse, his shadow falling over her. The children, playing nearby, fell silent and retreated to the safety of the porch. "A pleasant afternoon, madam," he said, his voice smooth and oiled. He tipped his hat. "My name is Abernathy. I handle certain land interests in this territory." Alara's hands stilled on the damp linen. She had heard the name whispered with a mixture of fear and resentment in town. Mr. Abernathy was the banker, the land agent, the man who held the deeds and the debt for half the county. "Mr. Kane is not here," she said, her voice polite but cool. "He's checking his trap lines." "Oh, I'm well aware," Abernathy said, his eyes roaming over the homestead with a proprietary air. They settled on her, and his smile widened. "A slick, unpleasant thing. It's you I wish to speak with. A woman of your quality. Seems rather out of place in such a rustic setting. Attached to a man of such brutish disposition." "I am where I belong," Alara replied, her chin lifting. Abernathy chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "Belonging is a fluid concept out here, Mrs. Kane. It is determined by deeds, by surveys, by the letter of the law." He reached into his coat and produced a rolled document tied with a ribbon. "This, for instance. This is the official survey map for this section. And it clearly shows that the spring Kane uses for his water, the very lifeblood of this pathetic little farm, is actually located 5 yards inside my property line." Alara's blood ran cold. The spring was everything. Without it, the garden would wither, the animals would die, they would have to haul water for miles. "Now, I am a reasonable man," Abernathy continued, his tone dripping with false magnanimity. "I might be persuaded to overlook this discrepancy for a price. Or perhaps a different sort of arrangement could be made. A man like Kane, he has no appreciation for finer things." His gaze lingered on her again, insolent and appraising, leaving a trail of slime across her skin. Rage, cold and pure, rose in Alara's throat. Before she could voice the scathing retort that burned on her tongue, a deep rumble came from behind her. Abernathy. Silas had emerged from the line of cottonwoods along the creek, moving with a silence that was terrifying in a man his size. He held a rifle in the crook of one arm, and his face was a thundercloud. Abernathy's horse shied, sensing the sudden, lethal tension in the air. "Cain," Abernathy said, recovering his composure, though his smile was now strained. "Just discussing a small matter of legal boundaries with your wife." "There is no matter to discuss," Silas said, his voice flat and deadly. "Get off my land." "Your land," Abernathy scoffed, emboldened by the document in his hand. "According to this official plat, you're little more than a squatter stealing my water. I could have the sheriff out here tomorrow and have you removed. Thrown off with nothing." He unrolled the map with a flourish. "See for yourself. The line is clear." Silas took a step forward, his knuckles white on the stock of his rifle. Alara knew what was about to happen. She saw the raw, physical violence coiling in his powerful frame, the culmination of years of quiet endurance against the town's scorn. Abernathy wanted this. He was goading him, hoping for an attack that would give him the legal right to seize everything. "No, wait," Alara's voice cut through the tension, sharp and clear. Both men turned to look at her, surprised. She stepped between them, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but her mind strangely, icily calm. Her late husband, for all his physical frailty, had been a clerk, a man of ledgers and law. He had taught her to read documents, to look for the details others missed. "May I see that?" she asked, her hand outstretched. Abernathy, amused, handed her the map. "By all means. Perhaps you can explain the finer points of cartography to your ignorant husband." Alara ignored the insult. Her eyes scanned the document, her finger tracing the lines, the notations, the official-looking seals. It looked convincing, but then she saw it. A small detail, almost insignificant. In the bottom corner was the county surveyor's signature and a date. The date was from 2 years ago. She looked up, her gaze steady. "This is a very impressive map, Mr. Abernathy. But my husband filed his homestead claim 3 years ago, under the Act of 1862. His claim, including his water rights, would have been registered with the Federal Land Office at that time. This survey, being more recent, cannot supersede a prior federal claim. You know that." She paused, letting the words sink in. "I also recall my late husband mentioning that any new survey that alters an existing property line must be filed at the county seat, and a notice posted for public review for 30 days. I've been to town, Mr. Abernathy. I've seen no such notice." She wasn't entirely certain of the law, but she spoke with an unshakable conviction born of pure desperation. She was defending her home, her children's future. Abernathy's smug expression dissolved, replaced by a flash of disbelief, then fury. He had expected a cowering woman and an explosive brute, not this calm, articulate defiance. He had underestimated her. Silas stared at her, a look of profound astonishment on his face. He lowered the rifle slightly. He was seeing her for the first time not as a burden he had claimed, but as a partner, a fighter with weapons he did not possess. He saw her mind, sharp and keen, and a courage that rivaled his own physical strength. "This is a forgery," Alara said, her voice gaining strength, "or at least a gross misrepresentation. I'm sure the circuit judge would be very interested to see it when he next passes through." Enraged and flustered, his bluff called by a woman he had dismissed as a mere chattel, Abernathy snatched the map from her hand. His face was a mask of pure malevolence. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he hissed, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "This isn't over. There are other ways to clear vermin off a property. This land will be mine, and everything on it." His eyes flickered meaningfully toward the children, who were watching, pale and silent, from the porch. The threat hung in the air, ugly and undeniable. He wheeled his horse around, dug his spurs into its flanks, and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and palpable menace in his wake. The silence he left behind was heavy and suffocating. Alara's knees suddenly felt weak, the adrenaline draining away, leaving her trembling. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling a chill despite the warmth of the sun. She had won the battle, but the threat of the war to come was terrifying. Silas did not speak. He walked past her and stood on the porch, his back to her, looking out over the prairie where Abernathy had disappeared. His massive frame seemed to fill the entire doorway, a silent, brooding guardian. She could not see his face, but she could feel the contained fury radiating from him, a dangerous, simmering heat. He had been ready to kill for them. She had stopped him, not with force, but with words and wit. She had stood with him. They had stood together. In that moment of shared victory and looming danger, the last of the walls between them seemed to crumble into dust. She was no longer just his responsibility. She was his ally. And in the vast, lonely silence of the prairie, that was everything. That night, the wind rose, a mournful, keening sound that rattled the cabin's single window and whispered through the chinks in the logs. Alara lay awake, the children sleeping soundly around her, but her mind was a whirlwind. Abernathy's threat echoed in her thoughts, a venomous promise. Beside the hearth, Silas sat in a chair he had built, cleaning his rifle by the low light of the fire. He hadn't gone to the barn. He was standing watch. The sight of his stoic, powerful silhouette was the only thing that kept her terror at bay. The attack came just before dawn, when the darkness is at its deepest and most absolute. A sudden, frantic whinnying from the horses, followed by a hellish orange glow that bloomed against the windowpane. Fire! Silas's voice was a roar that shook the cabin. Alara was out of bed in an instant, her heart seizing in her chest. The half-finished barn was ablaze, flames licking hungrily at the dry timber, roaring in the grip of the wind, which was now fanning them directly toward the cabin. "Get the children to the creek bed," Silas commanded, already pulling on his boots. There was no panic in his voice, only a fearsome, focused urgency. He grabbed 2 empty buckets and burst out the door. Alara's mind worked with a desperate clarity. She scooped a sleeping Rose from the bed, wrapping her in a quilt. "Caleb, Martha, Samuel, wake up, now!" she yelled, her voice sharp with an authority that cut through their sleepy confusion. "We have to go. To the creek. Quickly." She herded her terrified, crying children out into the chaotic night. The heat from the burning barn was a physical blow, the air thick with smoke and the terrifying crackle of consuming fire. She half-dragged, half-carried them toward the relative safety of the shallow creek, her lungs burning, her eyes streaming. She settled them under an overhang, shielded from the worst of the smoke and embers. "Stay here. Do not move," she ordered Caleb, her voice raw. He nodded, his young face pale and streaked with soot, his arms protectively around his younger siblings. Her family was safe, but Silas was not. A fierce, primal instinct surged through her. This was her home. He was her husband. She would not cower in a ditch while he fought alone. She ran back toward the inferno. Silas was a mythic figure silhouetted against the flames, a giant battling a dragon. He was throwing bucket after bucket of water from the well onto the cabin's roof, trying to keep the wind-blown embers from setting it alight. He moved with a speed and power that was breathtaking, a blur of relentless, desperate motion. But he was one man, and the fire was a ravenous beast. Without a word, Alara grabbed the other bucket and ran to the well. The crank was heavy, designed for his strength, but she put her entire weight into it, her muscles screaming as she drew the water up. She hauled the sloshing bucket toward the cabin, her dress soaked, her hair plastered to her face. Silas saw her, his eyes wide with surprise and something else, a fierce, blazing pride in the firelight. He gave a sharp nod of acknowledgement, and they fell into a rhythm. He drew, she hauled. He climbed onto the roof, a primeval god against a backdrop of flame, dousing the spreading sparks, while she kept the buckets coming, her arms and back aching with a pain she refused to acknowledge. Caleb appeared at her side, a small, determined shadow. "I can help, Mama," he shouted over the roar. He was too small for the well, but he grabbed a smaller pail and began to ferry water to wet down the cabin walls near the ground. They were a family, fighting together, a tiny, determined army against the encroaching darkness. They could not save the barn. It collapsed in on itself with a deafening groan, sending a geyser of sparks into the sky. But they saved the cabin. As the first pale, gray light of dawn broke over the scorched earth, they stood together, exhausted, smoke-stained, and victorious. The fire was a smoldering, hissing ruin, but their home still stood. Alara looked at Silas. His face was black with soot, his shirt was scorched, and a raw, red burn marred the flesh of his forearm. Without thinking, her exhaustion forgotten, she stepped toward him. Her hand, small and trembling, reached out and gently touched the skin next to the angry wound. The contact was electric, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had just endured together. He looked down at her hand on his arm, then his stormy gray eyes met hers. In their depths, she saw the walls he had built around himself finally, completely crumble to dust. The isolation, the loneliness, the stoic endurance. It was all stripped away, leaving only a raw, profound vulnerability. In that shared gaze, 1,000 unspoken words were exchanged. "He'll be back," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the smoke. "I know," Silas rumbled, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. He covered her hand with his own, his large, calloused fingers engulfing hers. "We'll be ready." The next day, Silas rode to redemption. Alara watched him go, a knot of fear in her stomach, convinced he was going for a confrontation that could only end in bloodshed. She spent the day cleaning the cabin, tending to the children, and trying to push down the rising tide of panic. He returned late in the afternoon, not battered and bruised, but clean and purposeful. He didn't carry a weapon. He carried a piece of paper. He strode into the cabin, which now felt more like a home than ever before, and handed it to her. It was a marriage certificate, properly signed and sealed by the circuit judge who had, by a stroke of providence, been in town. It was officially filed. It was real. He had faced Abernathy's threat not with the violence the man expected, but with the law, the very tool she had shown him how to wield. He had bound them together not just by a desperate agreement, but by the statutes of the land. He handed her a second document. It was a newly affirmed deed, one the judge had helped him secure, citing the federal homestead laws and clearly defining his water rights, making Abernathy's claim null and void. He had protected them. He had provided. Alara looked from the papers in her hand to the giant of a man standing before her. The silence in the room was soft, intimate. "You asked," he began, his deep voice softer than she had ever heard it, almost hesitant. "If I would still have you," he took a step closer, his presence filling her world. "I will. Always." The vow from that first day, "You're mine now," was no longer a statement of possession. It was a promise. It meant you are my family. It meant you belong here with me. It meant you are safe. Tears welled in her eyes, tears not of sorrow or fear, but of profound, overwhelming relief, of gratitude, of a love that had grown, quiet and deep, in the hard soil of their shared lives. She did not need to speak. She simply reached out and took his hand, her small fingers lacing with his. It was an answer, a vow of her own. Weeks later, Alara stood on the porch, a mended dress on her back and Rose cooing in her arms. The scar on Silas's arm had faded to a pale pink. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn. In the yard, near the charred remains of the old barn, Silas was laying the foundation for a new one, larger and stronger than the last. Caleb worked alongside him, his small face serious with purpose, passing his stepfather stones. Martha and Samuel were chasing butterflies near the garden, their laughter bright and clear in the prairie air. The landscape no longer seemed empty or menacing. It was their home, a place they had fought for and won. It was a place where a desperate widow with 4 children and a lonely giant had found not just a partnership of necessity, but a family, forged in silence, tested by fire, and bound by a quiet, resilient love. Silas looked up from his work and his eyes met hers across the yard. He smiled, a rare, true smile that reached his stormy eyes and transformed his harsh face into something beautiful. Alara smiled back, her heart full. The future would be hard. She knew, but they would face it together. They were his, and she knew with every fiber of her being, was theirs.